The sound of a gunshot echoed across the prairie as Margaret Jensen ducked behind a weathered stagecoach, her heart pounding against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. The year was 1875, and the Dakota Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially not one with a secret growing inside her. "Stay down, miss," a deep voice commanded as another shot rang out, splintering the wooden coach mere inches from her head. Margaret pressed herself flat against the dirt, the dust coating her already travel-worn dress. She hadn't wanted to stop in Montezuma, South Dakota, but the stagecoach driver had insisted they needed fresh horses. Now, caught in the crossfire of what appeared to be a bank robbery gone wrong, she wondered if she'd live to see nightfall. 3 more shots punctuated the air before an eerie silence fell over the small frontier town's main street. Margaret held her breath, clutching her small valise to her chest. Inside were all her worldly possessions: 2 dresses, her mother's silver hairbrush, and a letter she'd never send to the man who'd abandoned her. "It's clear now, miss. You can come out." She peered cautiously from behind the coach to see a tall man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest extending his hand toward her. His eyes were the color of the summer sky, set in a face tanned and weathered by years under the western sun. "Sheriff Miles Hammond," he introduced himself, helping her to her feet. "Sorry about the welcome to Montezuma. The Keller brothers have been causing trouble up and down the territory." Margaret brushed the dust from her skirt, trying to regain her composure. "Margaret Jensen," she replied. "I'm much obliged for your assistance, Sheriff." He tipped his hat, his gaze briefly moving to her midsection before returning to her face with such discretion she almost missed it. Almost. 3 months along wasn't showing much yet, especially not with her loose-fitting traveling clothes, but she'd noticed some men had an uncanny sense about such things. "Where are you headed, Miss Jensen?" he asked, retrieving her small bag from the dirt. "West," she answered vaguely. "Wherever the next coach is going." The sheriff frowned slightly. "I'm afraid that might be a problem. The shooting spooked the horses. Driver says they'll need a day or 2 to get a new team from the next town over." Margaret felt her stomach sink. She had precisely $4.68 to her name, not enough for a hotel room for multiple nights, not in a place like this. "Is there somewhere I might find work?" she asked, straightening her shoulders. "Just temporarily until the coach leaves." Miles Hammond studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house might need help. Her usual girl left to get married last month." He hesitated, then added, "She's a good Christian woman, but she can be particular about who she takes in." Margaret understood his meaning perfectly. A single woman traveling alone already raised eyebrows. A single pregnant woman would raise considerably more. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll speak with her." As the sheriff led her down the dusty main street toward the boarding house, Margaret couldn't help but notice how the townspeople stared. Women pulled their children closer. Men tipped their hats but kept their distance. She was an outsider, and in places like Montezuma, outsiders weren't trusted. The boarding house stood at the end of the street, a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a small, well-kept garden. As they approached the front porch, the door swung open to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a perpetual frown. "Another stray, Miles?" the woman asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Miss Jensen. Stage won't be leaving for a couple of days on account of the commotion in town. She's looking for temporary work and a place to stay." The older woman's eyes narrowed as she assessed Margaret from head to toe. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam, clean." "Very well, Mrs. Patterson's lips pursed. "I suppose I could use the help. $3 a week and a room in the attic, meals included." Margaret could have wept with relief. "That's very generous, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," the woman replied dryly. "The roof leaks when it rains, and you'll be up before dawn to help with breakfast." Sheriff Hammond gave Margaret a reassuring smile. "Mrs. Patterson's cooking is worth the early rising," he said. "Best biscuits in the territory." The older woman's stern expression softened slightly at the compliment. "Go on with you, Miles. I'm sure you've got criminals to chase." "Yes, madam." He turned to Margaret. "If you need anything, the sheriff's office is just down the street." As he walked away, Margaret couldn't help but watch him go. There was something about his quiet confidence that made her feel safer than she had in months. "Well, don't just stand there catching flies," Mrs. Patterson said, holding the door open wider. "Come in and I'll show you what needs doing." The attic room was exactly as promised, small, sparse, and with a suspicious water stain on the ceiling above the narrow bed. But it was clean, and for the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Montezuma could be a temporary haven while she figured out her next move. That evening, after helping serve dinner to the boarding house's 5 permanent residents, 2 elderly sisters, a railroad surveyor, a young schoolteacher, and a taciturn man who Margaret suspected was a gambler, she found herself in the kitchen washing dishes while Mrs. Patterson needed dough for the morning's bread. "So," the older woman said without looking up from her work, "what brings a young woman like yourself all the way out here, traveling alone?" Margaret had prepared for this question. "My father passed away. I'm going to stay with relatives in California." Mrs. Patterson's hands never stopped working the dough. "Must be distant relatives if they didn't send someone to escort you." "Very distant," Margaret agreed, scrubbing harder at a stubborn pot. A heavy silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the rhythmic sound of dough being slapped against the wooden table. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke again. "I won't pry into your business, Miss Jensen. The good Lord knows we've all got our secrets." She paused, her flour-covered hands going still for a moment. "But if there's anything you need, anything at all, you just say the word." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. Don't mention it," Mrs. Patterson replied gruffly. "Now finish those dishes and get some rest. Morning comes early around here." The next day passed in a blur of chores, making beds, sweeping floors, peeling potatoes, and serving meals. By nightfall, Margaret's back ached and her feet throbbed, but there was comfort in the exhaustion. When she was working, she didn't have time to worry about her future or mourn her past. On her 3rd day in Montezuma, as she was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house, Sheriff Hammond appeared at the gate. "Afternoon, Miss Jensen," he called, hat in hand. "How are you settling in?" Margaret pinned a sheet to the line before answering. "Very well, thank you. Mrs. Patterson has been kind." He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "She's got a heart of gold under all that vinegar." A comfortable silence fell between them as Margaret continued hanging clothes and the sheriff watched, seemingly content just to be in her company. "The stage will be leaving tomorrow," he finally said. "Driver got back with fresh horses this morning." Margaret's hand stilled on a pillowcase. "I see. Thank you for letting me know." Miles took a step closer, his expression earnest. "Miss Jensen, Margaret, may I speak plainly?" She nodded, her throat suddenly dry. "I don't know what or who you're running from, but Montezuma's not a bad place to stop running." He glanced around at the modest town. "It's not much to look at, I know, but folks here are decent, once they get to know you." "That's very kind, Sheriff, but Miles," he interrupted gently. "Call me Miles." "Miles," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate on her lips. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't stay." He studied her face for a long moment. "Can't or won't, Before she could answer, Mrs. Patterson's voice called from the back door. "Margaret, there's a gentleman here to see you." Margaret froze, her blood turning to ice. No one knew she was here. No one except— "Excuse me," she murmured to Miles, hurrying past him toward the house. In the front parlor, a man stood with his back to her, examining the small collection of books on Mrs. Patterson's shelf. He wore an expensive suit, the cut and fabric clearly from back east. When he turned, Margaret's worst fears were confirmed. "Hello, Margaret," said Edward Blackburn, his handsome face set in an expression of cold determination. "You've led me on quite a chase." Mrs. Patterson hovered anxiously by the door. "He says he's your fiancé, dear." "I told him you were out back." Margaret forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Could you give us a moment?" The older woman nodded and withdrew, though not without a backward glance of concern. As soon as they were alone, Margaret backed away from Edward, putting the settee between them. "How did you find me?" He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Your landlady in St. Louis was quite helpful once I mentioned our engagement. She told me you'd been asking about stagecoach routes west." He took a step toward her. "Did you really think you could hide from me? That you could take what's mine and disappear?" "It's not yours," Margaret said, her hands instinctively moving to shield her stomach. "You made that perfectly clear when you told me to take care of it." Edward's expression darkened. "I've changed my mind. You're my fiancé, and that," he nodded toward her midsection, "carries my name. You will return to St. Louis with me immediately." "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "I'm not going anywhere with you." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with bruising force. "Don't be difficult, Margaret. You know what happens when you're difficult." "I believe the lady said no." They both turned to see Miles standing in the doorway, his right hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Edward released Margaret's wrist but didn't back down. "This is a private matter, sir. My fiancé and I are having a discussion." "Is that so?" Miles looked at Margaret. "Miss Jensen, are you engaged to this man?" She lifted her chin. "I was, not anymore." Edward's face flushed with anger. "Margaret, you're being ridiculous. Think about your reputation, your future. Who's going to want you now?" "That's enough," Miles said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable threat. "I think it's time for you to leave, mister." "Do you know what she is? What she's carrying?" Edward sneered. "Ask her. Ask her whose child she's bearing out of wedlock." Miles didn't take his eyes off Edward. "I don't care much for men who talk about ladies that way. Now you can walk out of here on your own, or I can help you. Your choice." For a tense moment, Margaret thought Edward might try to fight. Then, with a cold smile, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "I'll be at the hotel when you come to your senses, Margaret. One way or another, you're coming back with me." He tossed the paper onto the settee. "Your father's debts didn't disappear when he died. Someone has to pay them." After Edward left, Margaret collapsed onto the settee, her legs no longer able to support her. Miles came to sit beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, though she felt far from all right. "He's not really my fiancé anymore. We were engaged, but when I told him about—" She stopped, unable to continue. Miles picked up the paper Edward had left behind. "May I?" At her nod, he unfolded it and scanned the contents. "This is a notice of debt collection against your father's estate. It's addressed to you as next of kin." Margaret took a shaky breath. "My father gambled. I didn't know how bad it was until after he died. Edward offered to settle the debts if I married him." She laughed bitterly. "He was so charming, so generous, I thought he loved me." "But he didn't," Miles guessed. "No. He wanted an obedient wife who would look pretty on his arm and bear his children when it suited him." She looked away. "When I found myself with child before the wedding, he told me to get rid of it. When I refused, he broke off our engagement and threw me out." Miles was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he carefully folded the debt notice and handed it back to her. "You want to press charges against him for grabbing you like that?" Margaret shook her head. "It would only make things worse. He's an important man in St. Louis. His family has connections. Important men aren't above the law, Miss Jensen, not in my town." His town. The words gave her a strange feeling of warmth despite her circumstances. "Thank you, but no, I just need to get away from him." Miles nodded, though he didn't look happy about it. "The stage leaves at noon tomorrow. I'll make sure he doesn't bother you until then." After he left, Margaret sat alone in the parlor, the debt notice clutched in her hand. The amount was staggering, far more than she could ever hope to repay on her own. Had her father really lost this much? Or had Edward inflated the numbers to ensure she had no choice but to return to him? Either way, running no longer seemed like an option. If she kept going west, Edward would just follow. He was too proud, too possessive to let her go, especially now that he'd decided he wanted the child after all. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in the narrow attic bed, listening to the occasional creak of the house settling and trying to formulate a plan. By the time dawn streaked the sky with pale fingers of light, she had made her decision. She would not run. Not anymore. Whatever life she built for herself and her child, it would be on her own terms. When she went downstairs to help with breakfast, Mrs. Patterson took one look at her face and handed her a cup of coffee without a word. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking bread, and for a moment, Margaret allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to stay in this place, to belong somewhere again. "You're not taking the stage today, are you, Mrs. Patterson asked, her back to Margaret as she stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove. "No," Margaret admitted, "I'm not." The older woman nodded as if she'd expected this answer. "Good. I need someone to help me put up preserves this week. The apricots are coming in." Margaret smiled, grateful for the older woman's unspoken acceptance. "I'd be happy to help." After breakfast, Margaret walked down to the sheriff's office. The morning was already warm, promising a scorching afternoon. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, women sweeping their porches, children racing each other to the schoolhouse at the end of the street. She found Miles at his desk, a cup of coffee at his elbow and a stack of wanted posters in front of him. He looked up when she entered, surprise and something else, pleasure perhaps, flickering across his face. "Miss Jensen, I was just about to come check on you. I wanted to let you know I won't be taking the stage today," she said, standing straight despite her nervousness. "I've decided to stay in Montezuma at least for a while." Miles set down the poster he'd been examining. "I see, and what about your situation?" "Edward, you mean?" She forced a smile. "I can't run from him forever. Sooner or later I'll have to face him." "That's not what I meant." His gaze dropped briefly to her midsection before returning to her face. "Though I'm glad to hear you're not running anymore." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. Of course he meant the baby. "Mrs. Patterson has asked me to stay on at the boarding house. She says she needs the help." Miles smiled. "Does she now? Funny, she told me just yesterday that business was slow and she was considering closing up a few rooms for the winter." Margaret couldn't help but laugh. "Well, she did mention something about preserves needing to be put up." "Ah, that explains it. Mrs. Patterson's apricot preserves are legendary in these parts." He stood, coming around the desk to stand in front of her. "I'm glad you're staying, Margaret. Montezuma could use more people like you." "You hardly know me," she pointed out. "I know enough." He hesitated, then added, "Would you allow me to call on you, properly I mean, with Mrs. Patterson's permission, of course?" The question caught her off guard. "You want to call on me, even knowing about—" She couldn't bring herself to say it. Miles took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Especially knowing. You're brave, Margaret Jensen. Braver than most men I know." Before she could respond, the door to the sheriff's office banged open and Edward Blackburn stormed in, his face contorted with rage. "There you are," he snarled, glaring at their joined hands. "I went to the boarding house and that old woman said you'd gone out, planning your escape again." Miles dropped Margaret's hand and stepped between her and Edward. "Mr. Blackburn, you need to calm down or I'll be forced to lock you up until the stage leaves." Edward ignored him, his focus solely on Margaret. "I spoke with the stage driver. He says you haven't purchased a ticket. What game are you playing, Margaret?" "No game," she replied, finding courage in Miles's solid presence beside her. "I'm staying in Montezuma." Edward's laugh was cold and cutting. "Staying? Here? In this God-forsaken backwater? Don't be absurd. There's nothing for you here." "There's nothing for me in St. Louis either, except a man who doesn't love me and debts I can't pay." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Those debts won't disappear just because you're hiding in the wilderness, and neither will I. That's my child you're carrying, and I won't allow my heir to be born in a place like this." Miles took a step forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Blackburn, I don't know how things work in St. Louis, but around here we don't talk to ladies that way. Now, I'm asking you politely to leave my office and get on that stage when it comes." Edward drew himself up, looking down his nose at Miles. "Do you know who I am, Sheriff? My father is a personal friend of the governor. One word from me and your badge won't be worth the tin it's made of." "Is that so?" Miles's voice remained calm, but Margaret saw the steel in his eyes. "Well, out here, we don't much care about who your daddy knows. What matters is how a man behaves." He reached for the cell keys hanging on a hook by his desk. "Last chance to walk out of here with your dignity intact." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension in the small office thick enough to cut. Then Edward's gaze shifted to Margaret. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot." After he stormed out, Miles let out a long breath. "Charming fellow." "Despite everything," Margaret laughed. "He wasn't always like that, or perhaps he was, and I was too blinded by his attention to see it. Men like that are good at hiding their true nature when it suits them." Miles returned to his desk, his expression troubled. "I don't like the way he threatened you, Margaret. He's not the type to give up easily." "I know." She sank into the chair across from him, suddenly tired. "But what can I do? He's right about one thing: the debts are real, and they won't disappear." Miles was silent for a long moment, studying the wanted posters on his desk without really seeing them. "How much does your father owe?" "According to Edward's documents, over $3,000. Miles let out a low whistle. "That's a considerable sum." "It might as well be 30,000, Margaret said bitterly. "I don't have it and I never will." "Maybe not on your own," Miles said slowly, "but there might be other ways." Before he could elaborate, the door opened again, and a young boy of about 12 stuck his head in. "Sheriff, there's a fight at the saloon. Mr. Peterson and Mr. Walsh are going at it something fierce," Miles sighed, reaching for his hat. "Duty calls. Stay here, Margaret. I'll be back as soon as I can." After he left, Margaret sat alone in the sheriff's office, wondering what Miles had meant by other ways. Surely he wasn't suggesting anything improper. He didn't seem the type, but then again, she'd been wrong about men before. Unable to sit still, she began tidying the office, straightening the papers on the desk and dusting the shelves with her handkerchief. When she opened a drawer looking for a place to put some scattered pencils, she found a small leather-bound book. Curiosity getting the better of her, she opened it to discover it was a journal, written in a neat, masculine hand. She knew she should close it immediately. Reading another person's private thoughts was unforgivable, but a single sentence caught her eye. Found another deposit on the North Ridge today. If it's as rich as I suspect, it could change everything." Margaret quickly shut the book and returned it to the drawer. Miles Hammond had a secret of his own, it seemed. Was he prospecting for gold on the side? It would explain how a frontier sheriff could consider helping with a debt as large as her father's. The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside alerted her to someone's approach. She moved away from the desk just as Miles returned, his hat dusty and a small cut on his cheekbone. "Are you hurt?" she asked, stepping toward him without thinking. He touched his face, seeming surprised to find blood on his fingers. "It's nothing. Peterson threw a bottle that shattered against the wall, must have caught a piece." Margaret retrieved his handkerchief from his breast pocket and gently dabbed at the cut. What were they fighting about? Miles stood very still under her ministrations, his blue eyes watching her face. What men usually fight about in saloons: cards, liquor, and a woman who's too good for either of them. The easy way he spoke of such things reminded Margaret that he lived in a different world than she did, a rougher, more honest world where people said what they meant and fought for what they wanted. "Thank you," he said when she'd finished cleaning the cut. Not many would take the trouble. It was no trouble. She returned his handkerchief, now spotted with blood. "I should get back to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson will wonder where I've gone." "I'll walk you," Miles offered, reaching for his hat again. As they strolled down the main street together, Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. A woman alone with the sheriff in his office, and now walking with him in broad daylight, it would certainly cause talk. "People are staring," she murmured. Miles smiled, tipping his hat to Mrs. Miller, the general store owner's wife, as they passed. "Let them stare. You're not doing anything wrong. Aren't I, an unmarried woman in my condition, accepting attentions from a man she barely knows? Is that what I'm doing, paying you attentions?" His tone was light, but his eyes were serious when she glanced up at him. "Aren't you?" Miles stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Yes, Margaret, I am, and I don't care who knows it or what they think about it." Something in his direct gaze made her heart beat faster. "Why?" "You could have any woman in town. Why choose one who's carrying another man's child?" He seemed to consider his words carefully before responding. "Because when I pulled you out from behind that stagecoach, covered in dust and scared half to death, you looked me straight in the eye instead of at the ground. Because you've faced things that would break most people, and you're still standing. Because when you smile, really smile, not the polite one you put on for strangers, it lights up your whole face." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "You hardly know me," she whispered again, but this time it wasn't a challenge, it was wonder. "I'd like to change that," he said simply, offering her his arm to continue their walk. "If you'll let me." That evening, as she helped Mrs. Patterson prepare dinner, Margaret found herself humming softly, a habit she'd abandoned months ago when her life had begun to fall apart. "Someone's in a good mood," Mrs. Patterson observed, expertly rolling out pie crust. Margaret blushed, focusing on the carrots she was chopping. "It's a beautiful day." "MMHMM. Would that have anything to do with you and the sheriff walking arm in arm down Main Street this afternoon?" News traveled fast in small towns. "He was simply escorting me home." "Of course he was," Mrs. Patterson agreed, her tone suggesting she believed no such thing. "Miles Hammond is a good man. His wife died in childbirth 5 years ago, the baby too. He hasn't looked twice at a woman since, until now." Margaret's hand stilled on the knife. "I didn't know. Not many do. He doesn't talk about it." The older woman transferred the pie crust to a dish with practiced movements. "Just thought you should know what you're dealing with." Before Margaret could respond, a knock sounded at the back door. Mrs. Patterson wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it. "Well, speak of the devil," she said, standing aside to reveal Miles, his hat in his hands and his hair still damp from what appeared to be a recent bath. "Evening, Mrs. Patterson. Miss Jensen." He nodded to them both. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Mrs. Patterson replied, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Margaret and I were just discussing you as a matter of fact." Miles raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried? Depends on what you're here for, I suppose." He cleared his throat, suddenly looking less confident than Margaret had ever seen him. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Miss Jensen, privately if that's all right." Mrs. Patterson's smile widened. "The parlor's empty at the moment. I'll make sure it stays that way for a bit." She turned to Margaret. "I can finish up in here." Feeling both nervous and curious, Margaret followed Miles to the parlor, where the evening sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, casting patterns on the faded rug. "Please sit," Miles said, indicating the settee. Margaret did so, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Is something wrong? Is it Edward?" "No, nothing like that." Miles took a seat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "I've been thinking about your situation all day, and I believe I have a proposition for you." Margaret's heart sank a little. So he did want something from her after all. What kind of proposition? A business arrangement of sorts. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This is a deed to a piece of land about 2 miles outside of town, 160 acres with a small house and barn. It's not much to look at, but the land is good. There's a creek running through the north end and the soil is rich." Margaret looked at the deed in confusion. "I don't understand." "I'm proposing a partnership," Miles said. "I own the land, but I don't have time to work it properly with my duties as sheriff. You need a safe place away from your former fiancé and a way to support yourself and your child. I suggest we combine our resources." "You want me to work your farm?" Margaret asked, still not comprehending. Miles smiled. "In a manner of speaking, yes, but as a partner, not a hired hand. You'd live in the house, help make decisions about what to plant, what livestock to raise. We'd split the profits." "And what would you get out of this arrangement, a working farm instead of an abandoned one?" "A share of the profits and—" He hesitated. "The chance to spend time with you and your child if you'll allow it." Margaret stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "You want to be involved with my child, a child that isn't yours?" Miles's expression grew serious. "Margaret, I've learned the hard way that life doesn't always give you what you expect. Sometimes it takes away the things you thought were certain, and sometimes it offers you something unexpected in their place." He took her hand gently. "I can't explain it, but from the moment I met you, I felt like we were supposed to find each other." Tears blurred her vision. "I'm carrying another man's child," she admitted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A man who never loved me, who only wanted me for my family name and the connections it brought him. I have nothing to offer you, Miles, nothing except debts and scandal." Miles's thumb brushed over her knuckles. "Then we'll love it together," he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "The child, I mean, if you'll let me." Margaret couldn't speak, her throat too tight with emotion. This man, this kind, steady man she'd known for less than a week, was offering her everything she'd thought was lost to her forever. Security, respect, a home, and most precious of all, acceptance. "You don't have to answer now," Miles said, misinterpreting her silence. "Take some time to think about it. It's a big decision." "No," Margaret said, finding her voice at last. "I don't need time. I accept your proposition, Sheriff Hammond." His face lit up with a smile that transformed his features from merely handsome to breathtaking. "Miles," he corrected gently. "If we're to be partners, you should call me Miles." "Miles," she repeated, smiling through her tears. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, still holding hands until Mrs. Patterson's voice called from the kitchen. "If you two are done in there, dinner's ready and the boarders are getting restless." Miles squeezed her hand once more before releasing it. "We'll talk more tomorrow about the details. I can take you out to see the place if you'd like." "I'd like that very much." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a crisp autumn edge to the air that hinted at the coming change of seasons. Margaret dressed with care in her best dress, a navy blue cotton with white piping that she'd managed to adjust to accommodate her changing figure. Mrs. Patterson eyed her approvingly as she came down for breakfast. "You look nice. The sheriff's coming at 9, I expect?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, unable to keep the smile from her face. "He's taking me to see the farm." The older woman nodded, her expression softening. "It's a good piece of land." His wife had big plans for it before. She trailed off. "Well, it'll be nice to see it come to life again." After helping with the breakfast dishes, Margaret went to wait on the front porch, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. At precisely 9 o'clock, a wagon pulled up in front of the boarding house, Miles at the reins. "Good morning," he called, jumping down to help her up onto the seat. "You look lovely." Margaret felt herself blush at the compliment. "Thank you. It's my only good dress, I'm afraid." "You make it look like it came straight from Paris," he assured her, his hand warm and strong as he helped her up. The ride to the farm took them through the town and out along a well-traveled road that followed the winding path of a small creek. They passed several prosperous-looking homesteads before turning onto a narrower track that led up a gentle slope. "There it is," Miles said as they crested the hill. "Hammond Farm." Below them stretched a patchwork of fields, some overgrown with weeds, others showing signs of recent clearing. A small white farmhouse sat nestled against a backdrop of cottonwood trees, with a weathered barn and several outbuildings nearby. It wasn't grand by any means, but to Margaret, who had spent the last months living in boarding houses and sleeping on stage coaches, it looked like paradise. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Miles looked pleased. "It needs work. I've been keeping up with the basic maintenance when I can, but I haven't had time to really bring it back to what it was." As they pulled up in front of the house, Margaret noticed a small fenced garden to one side, overgrown but still showing signs of structure. "Was that a kitchen garden?" "Yes. Sarah, my wife, she loved growing herbs and vegetables." His voice carried a hint of old grief, but not as raw as Margaret had expected. "She would have liked you, I think." The thought warmed Margaret strangely. "I would have liked to know her." Miles helped her down from the wagon and led her to the front door. "The house isn't much, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, a parlor, kitchen, and a small room off the kitchen that Sarah used as a pantry." Inside, the house was clean but sparsely furnished, with simple curtains at the windows and well-worn but good quality furniture. Margaret could see touches of a woman's hand in the faded wallpaper and the carefully sewn cushions on the settee, but there was a stillness to the place that spoke of years without a feminine presence. "The larger bedroom is upstairs," Miles explained, leading her through the house. "The smaller one is down here, just off the parlor. I thought that might be better for you, especially once the baby comes. Fewer stairs to manage." The thoughtfulness of this consideration brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "Yes, that makes sense." They spent the next hour touring the farm, Miles pointing out the barn where he kept his 2 horses and a milk cow, the chicken coop that currently housed only 3 elderly hens, and the various fields and what might be planted in each. "The south field gets the best sun. Good for corn. The western one is a bit rockier, but it would do well for potatoes or other root vegetables. The eastern field I've been thinking might be good for wheat, but it needs the most clearing." Margaret listened attentively, already envisioning how the farm might look once restored to its full potential. What about hiring help? You can't manage all this alone with your sheriff duties, and I won't be much use in the fields in my condition. I thought we might start with the Cooper boy Jake. He's 16, strong as an ox, and his family could use the extra money. We could pay him to help with the heavy work a few days a week. The word sent a pleasant shiver through Margaret. It had been so long since she'd been part of any we. As they walked back toward the house, Miles suddenly stopped, looking somewhat nervous. "There's something else I should mention, Margaret, about our arrangement." She tensed slightly. "Yes, people in town will talk. A single woman living alone on a man's property, even if that man lives in town most of the time, it won't look proper." "I've thought of that," Margaret admitted. "But I'm already ruined in the eyes of society. What's one more scandal?" Miles shook his head firmly. "You're not ruined, and I won't have people thinking badly of you or your child." He took a deep breath. "Which is why I think we should marry." Margaret stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Marry? It would be a marriage of convenience, of course," he hastened to add. "To protect your reputation and give the child a name, you'd have your own room and I would never. That is, I wouldn't expect." He stopped, clearly flustered. Despite the seriousness of the moment, Margaret couldn't help but smile at his discomfort. This strong, confident man who faced down outlaws without blinking was blushing like a schoolboy. "Are you proposing to me, Sheriff Hammond?" Miles straightened his shoulders, regaining some of his composure. "I suppose I am, Miss Jensen, though not very well, it seems." "On the contrary," she said softly, "I think it might be the finest proposal a woman in my position could hope for." Hope flared in his eyes. "Is that a yes?" Margaret considered carefully before answering. Marriage to Miles would solve many practical problems. It would give her child legitimacy, provide a home and security, and shield her from Edward's continued pursuit. But it would also tie her to this man, this place, in a way that went beyond their initial business arrangement. "If we marry," she said slowly, "it can't just be on paper. Not if we want people to believe it's real. We would have to live as husband and wife, at least in public." Miles nodded, his expression serious. "I understand, and I would never do anything to make you uncomfortable or to disrespect the vows we'd take, even if they were spoken for practical reasons. What if someday you meet someone you truly want to marry, someone you could love?" His eyes softened as he looked at her. "Margaret, I'm not proposing this lightly or without consideration for what it means. I may not be in love with you, we barely know each other, but I respect you deeply, and I believe we could build a good life together. A real partnership. And the child. Would you truly be willing to raise another man's child as your own?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "The child is innocent in all this and deserves a father who will love and protect them. I would be honored to be that person if you'll have me." Margaret searched his face for any sign of doubt or deception, but found only sincerity. "Then yes, Miles Hammond, I will marry you." The relief and joy that transformed his features made her heart skip a beat. He took both her hands in his grip warm and sure. "Thank you, Margaret. I promise you won't regret this." As they stood there, hands joined under the vast Dakota sky, Margaret found herself believing him. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. News of their engagement spread through Montezuma like wildfire. By suppertime that same day, it seemed everyone in town knew that Sheriff Hammond was to marry the mysterious Miss Jensen from back east. Reactions were mixed. Some expressed genuine happiness for Miles. Others barely disguised disapproval of his choice of bride, and still others speculated openly about the hasty nature of the match. "Heard old man Tucker asking if you were in trouble, Mrs. Patterson reported as she helped Margaret pack her few belongings the next morning. "I told him the only one in trouble was him if he didn't mind his own business." Margaret smiled gratefully. Thank you for defending me, and for everything else you've done." The older woman waved away her thanks. "Pshaw, I haven't done anything special, just what any decent Christian would do." She folded a nightgown with efficient movements. "Besides, it's about time Miles Hammond had someone to care for again. That man's been alone too long. Did you know her well? His wife?" Margaret couldn't help asking. Mrs. Patterson's hand stilled for a moment. "Sarah. Yes, I knew her since she was a girl. Sweet thing, always smiling. Miles was devoted to her when she died." She shook her head. "I thought we might lose him too for a while, but he's strong, Miles is. Stronger than most." "I don't want to replace her," Margaret said quietly. "I couldn't. Of course not. No one's asking you to." Mrs. Patterson fixed her with a stern look. "You just be yourself, Margaret Jensen. That's more than enough." The wedding was set for the following Sunday after church services, a simple ceremony with Reverend Collins officiating, and the entire town invited to witness. Margaret had worried about what to wear, having no proper wedding dress, but Mrs. Patterson surprised her by producing a beautiful cream-colored silk gown that had belonged to her own daughter. "She wore it when she married a railroad man 10 years ago," Mrs. Patterson explained as she helped Margaret try it on. "Lives in Chicago now with 3 little ones. Sends me a letter every month." She stepped back to assess the fit. "Might need to let it out a bit in the middle, but otherwise it's perfect." On the day before the wedding, Margaret was in the boarding house kitchen helping Mrs. Patterson prepare food for the reception when the front door burst open with a bang. Edward Blackburn stormed in, his face contorted with rage. "There you are," he snarled, advancing on Margaret. "I've just heard the most interesting news. It seems my fiancé is marrying the local lawman tomorrow." Margaret backed away, putting the kitchen table between them. "I'm not your fiancé, Edward. I haven't been for months. Is that what you think? That you can just walk away from me? That you can take my child and give it another man's name?" His voice rose with each question, his carefully cultivated Eastern polish giving way to raw fury. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, brandishing a rolling pin. "Now see here, young man. You can't just barge into my home shouting like a lunatic. I'll thank you to leave immediately, or I'll call the sheriff." Edward's cold laugh sent chills down Margaret's spine. "By all means, call the sheriff. I'd love to have a word with the man who thinks he can steal what's mine." "I'm not yours," Margaret said firmly, finding strength in her anger. "I never was. You made that very clear when you threw me out for refusing to kill our child." Edward's face darkened even further. "That was a momentary lapse in judgment. I've reconsidered. You will return to St. Louis with me, Margaret, tomorrow on the morning stage. I've already purchased the tickets. She's not going anywhere with you." Miles's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with his hand on his gun. "I thought I made that clear the last time we spoke." Edward turned to face him, a sneer twisting his handsome features. "Ah, the gallant sheriff. Come to rescue the damsel in distress." He looked Miles up and down contemptuously. "Tell me, what's your stake in this? She's carrying my child, you know, damaged goods." In a flash, Miles crossed the room and seized Edward by his expensive lapels, lifting him slightly off the ground. "You ever speak about her that way again, and badge or no badge, I'll make you regret it." For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Edward's eyes. "Unhand me at once. This is assault." Miles released him with a small shove that sent Edward stumbling back against the wall. "Consider that a friendly warning. Now get out and don't come back. Margaret has made her choice." "This isn't over," Edward spat, straightening his rumpled jacket. "I have rights. That's my child she's carrying." "A child you wanted dead," Margaret reminded him, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You have no rights here, Edward. Not anymore." For a moment it seemed he might continue to argue. Then, with a final venomous glare, he stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Mrs. Patterson let out a long breath. Well, I never, in all my days. She set down the rolling pin and brushed flour from her apron with trembling hands. That man needs a lesson in manners. Miles turned to Margaret, his eyes full of concern. Are you all right? She nodded, though she felt far from all right. Do you think he'll try something tomorrow? I wouldn't put it past him. Miles frowned. I'll ask Deputy Wilson to keep an eye on him tonight, make sure he gets on that morning stage one way or another. That night, Margaret slept fitfully, her dreams haunted by Edward's angry face and threats. When she finally gave up and rose at dawn, she found Mrs. Patterson already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. Couldn't sleep either, huh? The older woman asked, pouring her a cup. Margaret accepted it gratefully. No, I keep thinking about what Edward might do. Don't you worry about that snake in fancy boots. Miles Hammond won't let him ruin your day. Mrs. Patterson patted her hand reassuringly. Now drink your coffee and try to eat something. Can't have you fainting at the altar. The morning passed in a blur of activity, bathing, dressing, arranging her hair with Mrs. Peterson's help, and trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach. By the time they were ready to leave for the church, Margaret was a bundle of nerves, as much from the fear of Edward's interference as from the momentousness of the day itself. You look beautiful, Mrs. Patterson assured her as they stepped onto the porch. Like an angel. A wagon waited to take them to the church, driven by Deputy Wilson, a lanky young man with a shock of red hair and freckles. Morning, ladies, he greeted them cheerfully. Ready for the big day, Miss Jensen. As ready as I'll ever be, Margaret replied, allowing him to help her up onto the seat. Any sign of Mr. Blackburn? Wilson shook his head. Not a peep. Sheriff Hammond had me watching the hotel all night. Far as I know, he's still in his room. This was somewhat reassuring, though Margaret couldn't quite shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. The ride to the church was mercifully short, and before she knew it, they were pulling up outside the white clapboard building where it seemed the entire population of Montezuma had gathered. Quite a turnout, Mrs. Patterson observed as Wilson helped them down. Haven't seen the church this full since the Christmas pageant last year. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothing the cream silk of her borrowed wedding dress. I don't know if I can do this. Mrs. Patterson took her hands firmly. Of course you can. You're one of the strongest women I've ever met, Margaret Jensen. Now straighten your shoulders and remember you deserve this happiness. Inside the church, Mrs. Peterson's daughter Emily was playing the piano, the sweet notes of Jesu, joy of man's desiring filling the simple sanctuary. As Margaret stood in the vestibule, waiting for her cue to walk down the aisle, she caught her first glimpse of Miles standing at the altar. He wore a dark suit she hadn't seen before, his badge polished to a high shine on his vest, and his usually tousled hair neatly combed. He looked handsome, solid, and slightly nervous, a combination that endeared him to her even more. Ready? Mrs. Patterson asked as the music changed to the wedding march. Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. With no father or brother to give her away, she had asked Mrs. Patterson to accompany her down the aisle, a role the older woman had accepted with unexpected emotion. Then let's go make you Mrs. Hammond, Mrs. Patterson said, taking her arm. The small church fell silent as Margaret appeared at the back, all heads turning to watch her progress up the aisle. She kept her eyes fixed on Miles, drawing courage from his steady gaze and warm smile. By the time she reached his side, her earlier fears had receded, replaced by a sense of rightness that surprised her. You look beautiful, Miles whispered as she took her place beside him. So do you, she whispered back, making him grin. Reverend Collins cleared his throat and opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, We are gathered here today in the sight of God and this congregation to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and traditional, with no mention of their unusual circumstances or the hasty nature of their union. When it came time for the vows, Miles's voice rang clear and confident through the church. "I, Miles Hammond, take thee, Margaret Jensen, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance. And thereto I plight thee my troth." When it was her turn, Margaret's voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger with each word. "I, Margaret Jensen, take thee, Miles Hammond, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance. And thereto I give thee my troth." "The ring, please," Reverend Collins prompted. Miles reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained quietly as he slipped it onto Margaret's finger. "I want you to have it." The gesture brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, touched by the significance of the gift. "By the power vested in me by God and the Dakota Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Collins declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He smiled at Miles. "You may kiss your bride." Miles hesitated for just a moment, his eyes asking a silent question. When Margaret gave a small nod, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. It was a brief, chaste kiss, but it sent a surprising warmth through Margaret's body. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Miles Hammond," Reverend Collins announced as they turned to face the congregation. The church erupted in applause, and Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had done it. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. The reception was held in the church hall, where the women of Montezuma had prepared a feast that would be talked about for months to come. Tables groaned under the weight of fried chicken, ham, potato salad, fresh bread, pies of every description, and in the center, a beautiful wedding cake made by Mrs. Patterson herself. As they received congratulations from what seemed like every resident of the small town, Margaret kept glancing toward the door, half expecting Edward to burst in at any moment. "He's gone," Miles murmured in her ear, noticing her anxiety. "Deputy Wilson saw him board the eastbound stage this morning, said he was in a foul mood, but he left." Margaret sagged slightly with relief. "Thank God." "Don't worry," Miles assured her, his hand warm at the small of her back. "Even if he comes back, he can't touch you now. You're my wife." "My wife." The word sent a strange thrill through her, despite the practical nature of their arrangement. The celebration continued well into the afternoon, with music and dancing and more food than the entire town could possibly eat. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Miles drew Margaret aside. "We should probably head home before it gets dark," he said. "Unless you'd rather stay longer." Home. Another word that carried unexpected weight. "No, I'm ready," she assured him, suddenly eager to begin this new chapter of her life. They said their goodbyes amid good-natured teasing and knowing looks from the townsfolk, many of whom had clearly consumed a fair amount of the whiskey that had mysteriously appeared despite Reverend Collins's disapproving frowns. Outside, a surprise awaited them. The wagon that had brought them to the church had been decorated with ribbons and flowers, with a hand-lettered sign proclaiming "Just Married" attached to the back. "Deputy Wilson's work, I suspect," Miles said with a laugh as he helped Margaret up onto the seat. "He fancies himself quite the artist." The ride to the farm was quiet. both of them lost in their own thoughts as the wagon rattled along the familiar road. The setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, and a cool evening breeze carried the scent of wild grasses and distant rain. "Looks like we might get a storm tonight," Miles observed, glancing at the darkening clouds on the western horizon. Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous about what awaited them at the farmhouse. Their marriage might be one of convenience, but the reality of living together as husband and wife was suddenly very immediate. As if reading her thoughts, Miles said gently, "Margaret, I meant what I said before. I don't expect anything from you that you're not ready to give. The smaller bedroom is yours for as long as you want it." Relieved yet strangely disappointed, Margaret smiled. "Thank you for everything." When they arrived at the farm, Miles helped her down from the wagon with careful hands. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hammond," he said, and without warning swept her up into his arms. "Miles," she gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck. "What are you doing, carrying my bride over the threshold?" he replied with a grin. "It's tradition, isn't it?" Margaret couldn't help but laugh as he carried her up the porch steps and through the front door. Inside, she was surprised to find the house transformed from the sparsely furnished place she'd seen days earlier. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a colorful rug brightened the parlor floor, and a vase of wildflowers sat on the small dining table. "Mrs. Patterson and some of the other ladies came out yesterday while we were in town," Miles explained as he set her carefully on her feet. "They wanted to make it more welcoming for you." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes at the thoughtfulness of these women who barely knew her. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. Miles showed her to the smaller bedroom, where a new quilt covered the bed and her few possessions had already been arranged on the dresser. "I'll bring in your trunk," he said. "Take your time settling in. I'll see to the animals." Left alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the intricate stitching of the wedding quilt. According to Mrs. Patterson, it had been made by the women of the church, each contributing a square as a wedding gift. The thought of these strangers coming together to welcome her made her throat tight with emotion. By the time Miles returned from the barn, Margaret had changed out of her wedding dress into a simple cotton frock and was in the kitchen, surveying the provisions that had been stocked there. "Mrs. Patterson seems to have thought of everything," she said as Miles entered, carrying an armload of firewood. "There's enough food here to last a week. She's a force of nature, that woman." Miles built a fire in the kitchen stove with practiced movements. "Are you hungry?" "I'm not much of a cook, I'm afraid, but I can manage eggs and bacon without burning down the house. Usually." Margaret smiled at his self-deprecating humor. "Why don't I cook? It seems only fair since you've provided everything else." Together, they prepared a simple supper of fried eggs, bacon, and leftover biscuits from the wedding feast. As they sat across from each other at the small table, Margaret was struck by how domestic it felt, as if they'd been married for years rather than hours. "What are you thinking?" Miles asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just that this is nice," she admitted. "Having a home again. I didn't realize how much I missed it." His eyes softened. "I'm glad. I want you to be happy here, Margaret." "I think I will be," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it. After supper, they sat in the parlor, Miles reading the newspaper while Margaret worked on mending one of her dresses. Outside, the promised storm had arrived, rain pattering against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder shaking the small house. "We should probably turn in," Miles said eventually, folding the newspaper. "It's been a long day." Margaret nodded, setting aside her sewing. An awkward moment followed as they both stood, suddenly very aware of the unusual nature of their marriage. "Well, good night then," Miles said finally, breaking the tension. Sleep well, Margaret. Good night, Miles. In her room, Margaret changed into her nightgown and brushed out her hair, listening to the sounds of Miles moving about in the house, checking the doors, banking the fire in the stove, his footsteps on the stairs to the upper bedroom. It was strange having another person in the house after so many months of being alone, but not unpleasantly so. She was just climbing into bed when a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by a blinding flash of lightning. The lamp on her bedside table flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. "Margaret," Miles called from upstairs. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she called back, just startled. The lamp went out. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, then a gentle knock at her door. "I have a lantern if you need it." "Please," she said, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders over her nightgown before opening the door. Miles stood in the hallway, a lit lantern in his hand and concern on his face. That was quite a bolt, struck close by from the sound of it. "Yes," Margaret agreed, taking the lantern from him. "Thank you for this." "Of course." He hesitated, his eyes lingering on her face in the golden glow of the lantern light. "If you need anything else, just call. I'm a light sleeper." "I will. Good night, Miles." "Good night, Margaret." As she closed the door and returned to bed, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this place, this life, this man. A month ago, she had been alone and desperate, fleeing from a man who had claimed to love her but had shown only cruelty when it mattered most. Now she was married to a man who had offered her kindness and respect from the start, asking little in return. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, this marriage of convenience might grow into something more meaningful in time. The thought was not unwelcome. The next morning, Margaret awoke to sunshine streaming through her window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then memory returned: the wedding, the farm, Miles. She was Mrs. Hammond now, mistress of this small farmhouse and partner to the man whose steady presence already brought her comfort. She dressed quickly and found Miles in the kitchen, frying bacon on the stove. He looked up as she entered, a smile warming his features. "Good morning. I hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all," she assured him, moving to take over at the stove. "I should have been up earlier to make breakfast." Miles waved away her concern. "No need for that. I'm used to cooking for myself. Besides, you're—" He stopped, glancing at her midsection. "With child," Margaret supplied, appreciating his discretion but seeing no need for it between them. "Yes, I am, but I'm not an invalid, Miles. Being useful makes me feel better, actually." He nodded, relinquishing the spatula to her. "Fair enough, but promise you'll rest when you need to. Dr. Collins said too much exertion isn't good for women in your condition." "Dr. Collins?" Margaret repeated, surprised. "When did you speak with him?" Miles looked slightly embarrassed. "After I proposed, I wanted to make sure I knew what to expect, how to help you. I hope you don't mind." The thoughtfulness of this gesture touched Margaret deeply. "I don't mind at all, thank you." After breakfast, Miles showed her around the farm more thoroughly than he had on her previous visit. The damage from the storm was minimal: a few fence posts down in the south field, and a branch fallen from one of the cottonwoods, but nothing serious. "I've got to go into town for a few hours," Miles said as they walked back to the house. "Sheriff's duties don't stop for wedding days, unfortunately. Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," Margaret assured him. "I have plenty to keep me busy." After he left, she spent the morning taking inventory of the house, making lists of what they had and what they needed. The previous occupant, Miles's wife, Sarah, had been an organized woman, and many of the household systems she'd put in place still functioned well. Margaret felt a strange kinship with this woman she'd never met, whose home she now occupied, whose husband she had married. In the afternoon, She started cleaning the small room off the kitchen that would eventually become the baby's nursery. It was currently used for storage, filled with boxes and old furniture, but it had a nice window that faced the morning sun and enough space for a cradle and the other necessities a baby would require. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the wagon approaching until it was pulling up in front of the house. Thinking Miles had returned early, she went to the front door, wiping dust from her hands onto her apron. The sight that greeted her froze her in her tracks. Edward Blackburn sat on the seat of a rented buggy, his expression cold and determined. "Hello, Margaret," he said, climbing down from the buggy with deliberate movements. "Or should I say Mrs. Hammond now? That was quite the performance yesterday." Margaret's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "What are you doing here, Edward? I thought you left on the morning stage." "I did. Got as far as the next town before I realized I couldn't let this farce continue." He advanced toward the porch where she stood. "You're making a terrible mistake, Margaret. This," he gestured dismissively at the farm, "isn't the life you were meant for." "You don't get to decide what life I'm meant for," Margaret replied, her hands clenching at her sides. "Not anymore." Edward's handsome face twisted with anger. "That's my child you're carrying. My blood, my heir. I won't allow it to be raised by some frontier lawman in the middle of nowhere." "The child is mine too," Margaret reminded him, "and Miles will be a better father than you could ever be." "Will he?" "A man who married a pregnant woman he barely knows." Edward laughed coldly. "Open your eyes, Margaret. He doesn't want you. He pities you." The words struck a nerve, voicing fears she had barely acknowledged to herself. "You're wrong," she said, though doubt crept into her voice. "Am I? What kind of man takes another man's leavings? One who's desperate, that's who." Edward took another step closer. "Come back to St. Louis with me, Margaret. Your father's debts can be settled. The child can have my name, my fortune. No one needs to know the circumstances of our marriage." "I'm already married," Margaret reminded him, holding up her left hand where her wedding ring glinted in the sunlight. Edward waved this away as if it were insignificant. "Marriages can be annulled, especially those that haven't been consummated." His gaze raked over her, making her skin crawl. "Has he bedded you yet, Margaret, or is he too noble for that?" "That's none of your business," she snapped, her cheeks burning with humiliation and anger. "Oh, but it is my business. Everything about you is my business." Edward's voice hardened. "I'm not leaving without you, Margaret. One way or another, you're coming back with me." Fear shot through her as she realized his intent. "Miles will be back soon," she warned, backing toward the door. "I doubt that. There was quite the commotion in town as I was leaving, something about a fire at the livery stable." Edward smiled thinly. "Your sheriff husband seemed very busy indeed." Margaret's blood ran cold. "You set a fire. People could be hurt." Edward shrugged. "A calculated risk. Now, are you coming willingly, or do I need to persuade you?" His hand moved to his pocket, where she could see the outline of what could only be a pistol. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to stall him, to escape, to signal for help. But they were too far from town, too isolated for anyone to hear her if she screamed. "Let me get my things," she said finally, hoping to buy time, "and write a note for Miles. He deserves that much at least." Edward considered this, then nodded. 5 minutes and leave the door open." Inside the house, Margaret moved quickly, her mind working feverishly. She had no intention of going anywhere with Edward, but she needed to find a way to defend herself. In the kitchen, her eyes fell on Miles's shotgun, kept loaded on hooks above the door in case of predators or intruders. With trembling hands, she reached up and took it down, praying she remembered correctly how to use it from the few hunting trips her father had taken her on as a child. The weapon was heavy, but she managed to hold it steady as she returned to the front door. Edward's eyes widened when he saw her, then narrowed dangerously. "Put that down, Margaret. You'll only hurt yourself." "Stay back," she warned, raising the shotgun to her shoulder. "I know how to use this." "Do you?" Edward took a step forward, his hand moving to his pocket. "I don't think you have it in you to shoot a man in cold blood, not even me." "Don't test me," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm not the same woman you knew in St. Louis. I've had to become stronger." For a tense moment they faced each other in silence, the air between them charged with danger. Then Edward smiled, a cold, calculating smile that chilled Margaret to the bone. "You win this round," he conceded, backing toward his buggy. "But this isn't over, Margaret. That child is mine, and I will claim it, one way or another." "The child is ours," she corrected firmly. "Mine and Miles's now. You gave up any claim when you told me to get rid of it." Edward's face contorted with rage. "We'll see about that." He climbed into the buggy and gathered the reins. "Enjoy your rustic idyll while it lasts, Mrs. Hammond. It won't be for long." After he drove away, Margaret sank onto the porch steps, the shotgun still clutched in her shaking hands. The confrontation had left her drained, both physically and emotionally. But beneath the fear and exhaustion, she felt something else: pride. She had stood up to Edward, had defended herself and her home. It was a small victory, but a significant one. She was still sitting there when Miles returned an hour later, his face grim and streaked with soot. He jumped down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, rushing to her side. "Margaret, are you all right? I just heard from the station master that Blackburn rented a buggy this morning, said he was heading out to visit an old friend." His eyes fell on the shotgun in her lap. "What happened?" Briefly, Margaret recounted Edward's visit and his threats. Miles's expression darkened with each word, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I should have known he wouldn't give up so easily," he said when she had finished. "I'm sorry, Margaret, I should have been here." "It's not your fault," she assured him. "You couldn't have known he would go so far as to set a fire just to get you out of the way." Miles frowned. "That's just it, I'm not sure he did. The fire started in a pile of hay that had been sitting too close to a lantern. Could have been an accident." "Or a convenient coincidence," Margaret suggested. "Maybe." Miles sat beside her on the steps, taking the shotgun gently from her hands. "You handled yourself well. Not many would have had the courage to stand up to a man like that." "I was terrified," she admitted. "But I kept thinking about the baby and you," she glanced at him shyly. "I couldn't let him take me away from our home." Miles's eyes softened at her words. "Our home," he repeated as if testing the phrase. "I like the sound of that." He hesitated, then asked, "Did you mean what you said to him? About the child being ours now?" Margaret nodded, placing a protective hand over her slightly rounded abdomen. "If you meant what you said about loving it together." "I meant every word," Miles assured her, covering her hand with his own. The gesture was intimate, tender in a way that made Margaret's heart beat faster. "We're a family now, Margaret. You, me, and this little one, and I'll protect you both with my life if necessary." As they sat together on the porch of their small farmhouse, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her despite the lingering threat of Edward's return. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she allowed herself to truly hope for the future, a future that now included Miles Hammond and the life they would build together. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm as Margaret and Miles adjusted to married life. Despite the unconventional nature of their union, they worked well together, each finding their place in their shared life. Margaret took charge of the house, bringing order and comfort to spaces that had been neglected for too long. Miles divided his time between his sheriff duties in town and working the farm, often returning home late in the evening tired but satisfied with the day's progress. True to his word, Miles had hired Jake Cooper to help with the heavier farm work. The gangly teenager proved to be a hard worker and quick learner, and under Miles's patient guidance, he thrived. By mid-October, they had cleared and prepared the eastern field for spring planting, repaired all the storm damage, and built a new chicken coop that soon housed a dozen young hens purchased from a neighboring farm. Throughout it all, Miles was unfailingly kind and respectful toward Margaret, never pressing for more intimacy than she was ready to give. They shared meals and conversation, worked side by side during the day, and retreated to their separate bedrooms at night. It was a comfortable arrangement, if somewhat lonely at times. As her pregnancy advanced, Margaret found herself thinking more and more about the child growing within her. Would it have Edward's cold, calculating nature? Or would it be shaped more by the love and guidance of the man who had chosen to be its father in all the ways that truly mattered? One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after supper, Margaret voiced these concerns to Miles. "What if the baby is like him?" she asked quietly. "What if there's something in the blood that can't be changed?" Miles considered her question seriously before answering. "I believe we're shaped more by love than by blood," he said finally. "My father was a hard man, quick to anger and slow to forgive. But my mother showed me a different way to be. I chose to follow her example rather than his. And you don't resent that the child isn't yours," Margaret pressed, needing reassurance. Miles set aside the bridle he had been mending and moved to sit beside her on the settee. "Margaret, from the moment you agreed to be my wife, everything changed. The child is mine, ours, in every way that matters. Blood is just blood." His sincerity moved her deeply. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. Miles remained perfectly still for a moment, clearly surprised by her action. Then his hand came up to cup her cheek, returning the kiss with tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, Margaret felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. Don't apologize," Miles interrupted softly. "Not for that. Never for that." Something had changed between them, a shift as subtle as the first hint of spring after a long winter. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself lingering at her bedroom door, wondering what might happen if she walked up those stairs to where Miles slept alone. But the moment passed, and she retreated to her solitary bed, telling herself it was too soon, that they needed more time to build the foundation of their relationship before taking that irreversible step. The first snow of winter arrived in mid-November, transforming the prairie into a vast white expanse that glittered in the sunlight. Margaret, now visibly pregnant at 5 months, found the beauty of it breathtaking. Having spent most of her life in the city, she had never experienced the profound silence that came with a heavy snowfall, or the way the world seemed to hold its breath under its white blanket. "It's beautiful," she said to Miles as they stood together on the porch one morning, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold. "It is," he agreed, though when she glanced at him, she found he wasn't looking at the landscape but at her. The intensity of his gaze made her blush. Life continued in its steady rhythm as winter deepened. Miles installed a small wood stove in Margaret's bedroom to keep her and the baby warm during the coldest nights. He brought her books from town, novels, poetry, and practical guides to child-rearing that they sometimes read together in the evenings, discussing what kind of parents they hoped to be. Mrs. Patterson visited regularly, bringing news from town, baby clothes she had knitted, and thinly veiled inquiries about the state of their marriage. "Separate bedrooms is all very well for now," she said during one such visit, "but that child will need brothers and sisters eventually." Mrs. Patterson, Margaret exclaimed, mortified. Don't Mrs. Patterson me, young lady. I'm just stating facts. The older woman patted Margaret's hand kindly. Besides, I've seen the way that man looks at you when you're not watching, like you hung the moon and stars. The observation stayed with Margaret long after Mrs. Patterson had gone. Did Miles really look at her that way? And if so, what did it mean? Their marriage had begun as a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way it had become more, at least for her. As Christmas approached, Margaret threw herself into preparations for the holiday. She baked cookies and pies, decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and even managed to find small gifts for Miles and Jake, a new pocket knife for the boy, and a fine leather-bound journal for her husband, having noticed his old one was nearly full. On Christmas Eve, a heavy snow began falling, turning the world outside their windows into a swirling white void. Miles returned from town just before the worst of it hit, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. It's getting bad out there, he reported, hanging his coat by the door. Sheriff's office is closed until after Christmas. No one's going anywhere for a while. Margaret felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect of having Miles home for several uninterrupted days. Well, we have plenty of food and enough firewood to last through New Year's if need be. After a simple but festive supper, they sat before the fire, watching the flames dance as the wind howled outside. Margaret had just put the finishing touches on a small pair of baby booties she was knitting when she felt a strange, fluttering sensation in her abdomen. "Oh!" she exclaimed, her hand flying to her belly. Miles was immediately alert. "What is it? Are you in pain?" "No, not at all," Margaret smiled, tears springing to her eyes. "The baby moved, I felt it." "Really?" Miles's face lit up with wonder. "Can I?" He gestured tentatively toward her rounded stomach. "Of course." Margaret took his hand and placed it where she had felt the movement. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if responding to its father's touch, the baby kicked again, more strongly this time. Miles's breath caught, his eyes widening. "That's incredible," he whispered. "Hello there, little one." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like a cocoon, shutting out the howling storm and the world beyond their small farmhouse. Without conscious thought, Margaret found herself leaning toward Miles, drawn by the warmth and wonder in his eyes. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Miles's arms encircled her gently, mindful of her condition but unmistakably possessive. Margaret surrendered to the sensations washing over her, the softness of his lips, the strength of his embrace, the rightness of being in his arms. When they finally broke apart, Miles rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know this isn't how we planned things, but I need to tell you something." She pulled back slightly to see his face. "What is it?" "I love you." The words were simple, direct, spoken with the same quiet honesty she had come to expect from him. "I think I have since the moment I saw you, covered in dust behind that stagecoach. I know it's soon, and I don't expect you to feel the same," but Margaret silenced him with another kiss, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "I didn't think it was possible after everything with Edward, but I do. I love you, Miles Hammond." His smile could have lit the darkest night. "Say it again." "I love you," she repeated, laughing through her tears. That night, for the first time, Margaret didn't sleep in her solitary bed. Instead, she followed Miles up the stairs to the room that had been his alone, where they discovered each other with tenderness and wonder that made their practical marriage into something sacred and true. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the night. Margaret awoke to find Miles watching her, his expression soft with love and contentment. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Hammond," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Merry Christmas, Sheriff Hammond," she replied, nestling closer to his warmth. They exchanged their simple gifts by the fire after breakfast, each touched by the thoughtfulness of the other. Miles had found a beautiful silver-backed hairbrush to replace the worn one Margaret had carried from St. Louis, and a tiny silver rattle for the baby. Margaret's gift of the journal was received with genuine appreciation, especially when Miles discovered she had inscribed the first page with a quote from Tennyson, "Love is the only gold." As they sat together in the golden light of Christmas morning, Margaret felt a sense of completion she had never known before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Edward's continued threats, the hardships of prairie life, the approaching birth of their child, they would face them together, bound by a love that had grown from the most unexpected of beginnings. The remainder of the winter passed in a blur of quiet domesticity and deepening love. As Margaret's pregnancy advanced, Miles became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and taking on many of her household duties when he was home. His concern touched her, though she sometimes had to remind him that she wasn't made of glass. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. She pointed out one evening when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. And most of them didn't have such attentive husbands hovering over them like mother hens. Miles had the grace to look sheepish. "I just want to make sure you're both safe," he said, placing his hand gently on her now prominent belly. "You and this little one are my whole world now." How could she argue with that? Margaret surrendered the laundry basket and allowed him to guide her to the comfortable rocking chair he'd brought from town specifically for her. As February gave way to March, the first hints of spring began to appear on the prairie. Tiny green shoots pushed through the melting snow, and the air carried the promise of renewal. Margaret, now in her 8th month, found herself nesting with increasing urgency, washing and folding the tiny clothes Mrs. Patterson had provided, arranging and rearranging the nursery until everything was perfect. Miles had built a beautiful cradle from oak, the wood polished to a warm glow, with a small carving of a bird on each end. "My father taught me woodworking," he explained when she admired it. One of the few useful things he passed on. Their peaceful preparations were interrupted one afternoon by the arrival of a letter addressed to Margaret in a familiar, elegant hand. Edward had been quiet since his confrontation at the farm months earlier, but it seemed he hadn't forgotten or forgiven. With trembling fingers, Margaret broke the seal and read, "My dear Margaret, I trust this letter finds you well, or as well as can be expected given your current circumstances. I have given much thought to our situation over the winter months, and I have come to a decision. I will be returning to Montezuma at the beginning of April to claim my child. I have consulted with several legal experts who assure me that, as the biological father, I have rights that cannot be superseded by your hasty marriage. I have also taken the liberty of retaining the services of a physician who specializes in determining paternity based on physical characteristics. I suggest you prepare yourself for my arrival. If you wish to avoid public scandal and legal proceedings, I recommend you come to an amicable arrangement with me regarding custody of the child. Yours sincerely, Edward Blackburn." Margaret's hands shook so badly the paper rattled. "No," she whispered, one hand instinctively going to her belly. "No, I won't let him take you." Miles found her still sitting at the kitchen table when he returned from town an hour later, the letter crumpled in her fist and tears streaming down her face. "Margaret, what is it? Is it the baby?" He was at her side in an instant, kneeling beside her chair, his face a mask of concern. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. As he read, his expression darkened from concern to anger. "This is nonsense," he said finally, setting the paper aside. "He has no legal claim. We're married, the child will bear my name, no court would side with him." "But what if they would?" Margaret pressed, her fear overriding logic. "He has money influence, and it is his child, biologically speaking." Miles took her hands firmly in his. "Listen to me, Margaret. I won't let him take our baby. Not ever. I promise you that. But no buts. We're going to face this together like we've faced everything else." He squeezed her hands reassuringly. "Besides, I have a few cards left to play that Mr. Blackburn doesn't know about." Margaret frowned, puzzled by his cryptic statement. "What do you mean?" Miles hesitated, then stood. "Come with me. There's something I should have shown you long ago." He led her to their bedroom, where he retrieved the leather-bound journal she had glimpsed in his desk drawer months before. "Do you remember when we first met, how I mentioned I had a proposition for you? A business arrangement?" Margaret nodded, still confused. "Well, it wasn't just the farm I was offering to share." Miles opened the journal to reveal carefully drawn maps and columns of figures. "3 years ago, I found something on the north ridge of our property, something valuable." Understanding dawned slowly. "Gold, silver, actually. A small vein, but rich enough." He showed her the maps, pointing to an area marked with crosses. "I've been working it quietly, just enough to prove its worth without attracting attention. The deposits I've already extracted are in a bank account in Sioux Falls, under both our names now." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "You're telling me we're wealthy?" "Not Blackburn wealthy," Miles clarified, "but comfortable. Enough that if it came to a legal battle over the baby, we could hold our own. Enough that you and the child will always be secure, no matter what happens." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Margaret asked, trying to absorb this unexpected revelation. Miles closed the journal, his expression serious. "At first, I was afraid you might think it was the only reason I wanted to marry you, for someone to help work the farm while I developed the mine. And then, well, it just never seemed like the right time." Margaret was silent for a long moment, digesting this new information. Then, to Miles's evident surprise, she began to laugh, a full, joyous laugh that released the tension that had been building inside her since reading Edward's letter. "What's so funny?" Miles asked, looking bemused. "Life," Margaret replied, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. "Just when you think you have it figured out, it surprises you. A month ago I was terrified of Edward because he could afford lawyers and I couldn't. And now you tell me that my sheriff husband is secretly a silver baron." Miles's lips twitched. "Hardly a baron. But yes, the irony isn't lost on me either." Margaret sobered, the reality of their situation reasserting itself. "Do you really think it will help? Against Edward, I mean." "I do," Miles said confidently. "Blackburn might have connections in St. Louis, but out here, money talks just as loudly as Eastern refinement. And when it comes down to it, most judges will favor a stable, loving home with 2 parents over a single father who abandoned his responsibilities until it suited him to remember them." Margaret felt a wave of hope rise within her. "So we fight." "We fight," Miles agreed, pulling her into his arms. "Together." The next few weeks were tense as they awaited Edward's arrival. Miles worked with the territorial judge and a lawyer from Sioux Falls to prepare for whatever legal action Blackburn might take. Margaret, meanwhile, focused on preparing for the baby's arrival, which Dr. Collins estimated would be in early April, potentially coinciding with Edward's return. As March drew to a close, Margaret began experiencing occasional contractions that Dr. Collins assured her were merely practice for the real thing. Braxton Hicks, he called them, after some English doctor who had studied the phenomenon. Perfectly normal at this stage. One evening in late March, As a spring storm lashed the farmhouse with wind and rain, Margaret felt a different kind of contraction, stronger, more purposeful, and accompanied by a strange pressure in her lower back. "Miles," she said, gripping the edge of the kitchen table as another wave of pain washed over her. "I think it's time." Miles looked up from the letter he was writing, his face draining of color. "The baby, now, but it's too early, isn't it? And the storm." "Apparently this little one doesn't care about the weather or the calendar," Margaret said, attempting humor despite her discomfort. "And first babies are often early, according to Mrs. Patterson." Miles was on his feet immediately, his momentary panic replaced by calm efficiency. "I'll get the wagon ready and go for Dr. Collins." "No." Margaret grabbed his arm as another contraction gripped her. "Don't leave me. Not in this storm. Send Jake, he can ride faster than the wagon would go in this mud anyway." Miles hesitated, torn between the need to get help and the desire to stay with his wife. "Jake went home hours ago before the storm hit." "Then we'll manage ourselves," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "Women have been doing this without doctors for centuries. Mrs. Patterson showed me what to do, just in case." The storm intensified as the night wore on, matching Margaret's labor pain for pain. Miles proved to be a steady presence at her side, following her instructions without question, fetching water when needed, supporting her as she walked the floor during the early stages, and holding her hand through the increasingly intense contractions. "You're doing wonderfully," he assured her as dawn approached, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "I'm so proud of you, Margaret." She managed a smile despite her exhaustion. "I never thought I'd be doing this, without a doctor or midwife," she panted between contractions. "But I'm glad. It's with you." As the first light of morning filtered through the windows, Margaret felt an overwhelming urge to push. Miles, his face pale but determined, positioned himself to receive the baby as Margaret had instructed him. "I can see the head," he reported, his voice filled with awe. "Just a little more, Margaret. You can do this." With a final, tremendous effort, Margaret pushed and felt the indescribable sensation of her child sliding from her body into Miles's waiting hands. "It's a boy," Miles announced, his voice choked with emotion. "A beautiful, perfect boy." The baby's lusty cry filled the room, the most wonderful sound Margaret had ever heard. Miles placed the squirming, red-faced infant on her chest, and she wrapped her arms around her son, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the perfection of the small human being she and Edward had created. "Welcome to the world." Miles sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, his other hand gently stroking the baby's downy head. "He's magnificent," he murmured, "just like his mother." Margaret looked up at her husband, her heart so full of love it felt like it might burst. "What shall we call him?" Miles considered for a moment. "What about William, after your father?" The suggestion touched Margaret deeply. Despite her father's flaws, she had loved him, and the thought of honoring his memory in her son's name felt right. "William Miles Hammond," she said, testing the name. "It's perfect." "Just like him," Miles agreed, bending to kiss first his wife, then his son, for that was how he thought of the tiny boy, regardless of whose blood ran in his veins. "My family," he said softly. "My whole world." The storm had passed by the time Dr. Collins finally arrived later that morning, looking harried and apologetic. "3 babies born last night," he explained as he examined mother and child. "Must be something in the air, or the storm." He pronounced both Margaret and William in excellent health, marveling at Miles's competent handling of the birth. "You missed your calling, Sheriff," the doctor joked as he packed up his bag. "You'd make a fine midwife." "I had an excellent teacher," Miles replied, his eyes never leaving Margaret and the baby. As word of William's birth spread through Montezuma, visitors began arriving at the farm. Mrs. Patterson first, of course, bearing a basket of food and more baby clothes. Then the Coopers with Jake, who looked simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the tiny infant, and various other townsfolk bearing gifts and good wishes. Through it all, Margaret and Miles received their guests with pride and joy, presenting their son as if he were a prince, which, in their eyes, he was. The joy of William's birth overshadowed the approaching threat of Edward's return, but didn't eliminate it entirely. As April began, Miles increased his vigilance, making sure either he or Jake was always at the farm when he had to be in town. Margaret, still recovering from the birth, tried not to let fear overshadow these precious early days with her son. William proved to be a good-natured baby, with a healthy appetite and a tendency to sleep soundly after nursing. He had a shock of dark hair that Margaret suspected came from Edward, but his eyes, when they began to focus, were a clear, bright blue like Miles's, a coincidence that delighted her husband to no end. "People will think he takes after me," Miles observed one evening as he held the baby, a finger trapped in William's tiny but surprisingly strong grip. "In all the ways that matter, he will," Margaret assured him, leaning against his shoulder to gaze down at their son. "You're his father in every way but one." The dreaded day of Edward's expected arrival came and went with no sign of him. A week passed, then two, with still no word. Margaret began to hope that perhaps he had changed his mind, had decided to leave them in peace after all. Then, on a bright morning in late April, as Margaret was hanging laundry in the yard with William sleeping nearby in a basket, she heard the sound of an approaching carriage. Her heart sank as she recognized the smart black buggy and matched pair of horses that could only belong to Edward Blackburn. The carriage pulled up at the gate, and Edward descended, looking every inch the prosperous Eastern businessman in his expensive suit and hat. But there was something different about him, Margaret realized as he approached, a haggardness to his features that hadn't been there before, a slight stoop to his normally proud shoulders. "Margaret," he greeted her, his tone lacking its usual arrogance. "You're looking well." "Edward." She stood her ground, positioning herself between him and William's basket. "You're late. We expected you weeks ago," he smiled thinly. "Yes, well, there were complications with my journey." He glanced around the farm, taking in the freshly plowed fields and the new fence Miles had installed around the kitchen garden. "I see you've settled in quite comfortably here." Margaret said nothing, waiting for him to reveal the purpose of his visit. Finally, he sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his immaculately groomed hair. "I received word that the child has been born," he said. "A boy, I understand." "Yes, his name is William." Edward nodded, his expression unreadable. "May I see him?" Margaret hesitated, every maternal instinct screaming at her to refuse. But there was something in Edward's demeanor, a weariness, a resignation that gave her pause. "Why?" she asked simply. Edward met her gaze directly for the first time. "Because I need to be certain." "Certain of what?" "That I'm doing the right thing." Confused but cautiously curious, Margaret moved aside to allow him to approach the basket where William slept peacefully, one tiny fist tucked against his cheek. Edward stood over the baby for a long moment, studying the small features with an intensity that made Margaret uneasy. "He looks like my father," Edward said finally, his voice oddly distant. "The same jawline." "Why are you really here, Edward?" Margaret asked, her patience wearing thin. "If you've come to try to take him, I should warn you that Miles and I are prepared to fight you with everything we have." Edward turned to her, a strange smile playing at his lips. Always so direct, It's one of the things that attracted me to you in the first place, you know. Most of the women in my social circle speak in nothing but pleasantries and innuendo. Edward, I'm not here to take him, he interrupted, his smile fading. That's what I came to tell you. I won't be pursuing any claim to the child. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. What? Why the change of heart? Edward was silent for a moment, his gaze returning to the sleeping infant. My father died, he said finally. 2 months ago, heart failure. I'm sorry for your loss, Margaret said automatically, though she had never met the elder Blackburn and from what Edward had told her during their engagement had little reason to mourn him. Edward acknowledged her condolence with a slight nod. His death has complicated matters. The business, the estate, it's all fallen to me now. I've been working day and night to keep things from falling apart. My father, it seems, was not as prudent in his financial dealings as I had believed. I see, Margaret said carefully, beginning to understand. And a scandal involving an illegitimate child and a legal battle in the Dakota Territory would not help matters. Precisely. Edward ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking older than his 30 years. The truth is, Margaret, I can't afford the distraction or the potential damage to my reputation right now. My father's creditors are circling like vultures. One hint of scandal and they could call in their loans. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed immediately by wariness. So you're willing to relinquish all claims to William, just like that? Not entirely without conditions, Edward admitted, reaching into his coat pocket to produce a folded document. I've had papers drawn up. A legal agreement stating that, in exchange for relinquishing all parental rights and claims, you and your husband will never seek financial support from me, and will never publicly acknowledge my connection to the child. Margaret took the papers, skimming the formal legal language. You want us to promise never to tell William who his biological father is. Is that so unreasonable? Edward countered. The boy has a father now, one who apparently wanted him from the beginning, which is more than I can say for myself. What good would it do him to know about me? Margaret considered this. It was true that Miles was William's father in every way that mattered, and would continue to be so as the boy grew. Was it worth preserving a connection to Edward just for the sake of honesty? I'll need to discuss this with my husband, she said finally. This isn't just my decision to make. Edward nodded, seemingly unsurprised by this response. Of course. I'll be staying at the hotel in town for 2 days. After that, I must return to St. Louis with or without your agreement. As if on cue, William began to stir in his basket, making the small mewling sounds that preceded his hungry cries. Margaret lifted him automatically, cradling him against her shoulder. Edward watched this with an expression Margaret couldn't quite decipher, not longing exactly, but something more complex, more human than she had come to expect from him. He is a fine-looking boy, Edward said softly. He deserves better than I could give him right now. With that, he replaced his hat, gave her a formal nod, and returned to his carriage. Margaret watched him go, William now fully awake and fussing against her shoulder, feeling as though a great weight had been lifted from her, though not entirely in the way she had expected. When Miles returned from town later that day, Margaret recounted the strange visit and showed him Edward's legal document. Miles read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. It seems straightforward enough, he said when he had finished. He gives up all rights to William, and in exchange, we never tell anyone, including William himself, that Edward is his biological father. Is it right, though? Margaret pressed, cradling their sleeping son against her chest. To keep such a secret from him? To let him grow up believing he's someone he's not? Miles considered this, choosing his words with care. I think That he is exactly who he is, regardless of whose blood runs in his veins. He's William Miles Hammond, our son. That's his identity, not some connection to a man who never wanted him in the first place. But what if he asks questions someday? What if he notices he doesn't look like you? Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Miles said simply. But for now, signing this agreement gives us what we want most, the certainty that Edward won't come back later and try to claim him. Margaret nodded slowly, seeing the wisdom in his words. So we sign. I think we should, but only if you're completely comfortable with it. Margaret looked down at William, sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the complex adult negotiations determining his future. In that moment, she knew with certainty that Miles was right. William's identity wasn't defined by biology, but by the love and care of the parents who raised him. And in that respect, he was already unquestionably a Hammond. Yes, she said, looking up at her husband with a smile. Let's sign. The next day, they met Edward at the hotel in Montezuma, where the territorial judge and a lawyer witnessed their signatures on the document. Edward seemed subdued, almost melancholy, as he watched Miles sign his name with a flourish beside Margaret's more delicate script. It's done, then, Edward said as the judge certified the agreement. I wish you all well. Miles, who had been coolly polite throughout the proceedings, extended his hand to Edward in a surprising gesture of reconciliation. Thank you for doing the right thing, Mr. Blackburn, for the boy's sake. After a moment's hesitation, Edward shook the offered hand. Take good care of them, Sheriff Hammond. They deserve that much at least. As they watched Edward's carriage disappear down the main street of Montezuma for what they believed would be the last time, Margaret felt a curious mixture of emotions: relief, certainly, but also a strange sadness for what might have been in another life, another world. Are you all right? Miles asked, sensing her mood. Margaret smiled up at him, threading her arm through his. More than all right. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be with exactly who I'm supposed to be with. Miles pulled her close, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. Let's go home, Mrs. Hammond. Our son will be hungry soon. Home. The word had never sounded sweeter. In the years that followed, the Hammond family thrived. The farm prospered under Miles and Margaret's careful management. The silver mine continued to produce enough wealth to ensure their comfort without drawing unwanted attention. And William grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his mother's kind heart and his adopted father's steady nature. When William was 2, he was joined by a sister, Sarah Elizabeth Hammond, named for Miles's first wife and Margaret's mother. Sarah was followed 2 years later by twins, James and Joseph, who kept the entire household in perpetual motion with their mischievous antics. On William's 5th birthday, as Margaret watched her oldest son blow out the candles on his cake, Miles's arm warm around her waist and their other children clamoring for their share of the treat, she reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. What are you thinking about so seriously? Miles murmured in her ear as Mrs. Patterson began cutting the cake amid the children's excited chatter. Margaret turned to look at her husband, the man who had offered to love another man's child as his own and had kept that promise with unwavering devotion. The years had added a few silver strands to his hair and fine lines around his eyes, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. I was thinking about what you said to me that day at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, she replied softly. When I told you I was carrying another man's child, Miles's eyes softened with memory, that we would love it together. Yes. Margaret's gaze moved to William, his face alight with joy as he helped his little sister with her piece of cake. You've kept that promise so beautifully, Miles. I don't think I've ever properly thanked you for that. No thanks needed, Miles assured her, pulling her closer. Loving William, loving all our children, is the easiest, most natural thing in the world for me. As their family celebrated around them, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that the confession she had made that day in Montezuma, terrified and desperate, had led not to rejection or shame, but to the greatest blessing of her life. A man who understood that love wasn't limited by blood or circumstance, but was a choice made new each day, a gift given freely and without reservation. "I love you, Miles Hammond," she whispered, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "And I love you, Margaret Hammond," he replied, turning to capture her lips in a proper kiss, much to the giggling disgust of their children. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Margaret stood at the window of their bedroom, gazing out at the starlit prairie. Miles came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Margaret leaned back against him, covering his hands with her own. "Completely," she assured him. "More than I ever thought possible," and it was true. The journey that had begun with a desperate confession and an unexpected offer of love had brought her to a place of such profound happiness that sometimes she still couldn't quite believe it was real. But it was as real as the man holding her, as real as the children sleeping peacefully down the hall, as real as the life they had built together on this wild, beautiful frontier. "Then we'll love it together," Miles had promised that day. And they had. They did. They would, for all the days of their lives.